The fourth problem that natural selection has is that it requires competition for survival of the fittest, and yet nature shows the exact opposite. And there's a big word here, symbiosis. And it simply means any type of close long-term interaction between two organisms of different species. So we'll give some examples in a moment. But first off, to get the concept, Darwin described nature as being everywhere, red in tooth and claw. Speaking of, killing and blood. But this is really not true. It's there in some ways, sure. There is tooth and claw in nature ever since the fall, Adam's fall, described in Genesis 3. But we do not observe the everywhere fought struggle for survival via competition that Darwin's theory demands. The universe is a massive interrelated system which is evident from the level of the galaxies all the way down to the living cell to the atom. For example, Charles Townes, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said this is a very special universe. It's remarkable that it came out just this way. If the laws of physics weren't just the way they are, we couldn't be here at all. The sun couldn't be there. The laws of gravity and nuclear laws and magnetic theory, quantum mechanics, and so on have to be just the way they are for us to be here. And he's saying it as an evolutionist, saying this is amazing that it worked out this way. Or he uses the word remarkable, but it's not really remarkable except that God made it that way. Another man, astronomer Paul Davies, said on the face of it, the universe does look as if it has been designed by an intelligent creator expressly for the purpose of spawning sentient, or the capacity to have feelings, beings. He said, like the porridge in the tale of Goldilocks and the three bears, the universe seems to be just right for life. There are interconnections and symbiotic relationships everywhere. Biologists call this mutualism. The environmental community, the biosphere, biosystems, ecosystems. Have you heard some of these words? This is what they're referring to, the fact that they work together. It's actually goes contrary to Darwinian evolution. For example, systems ecology is the study of nature as this gigantic system. And you've got CO2 coming out from the plants and going back in up into the atmosphere and taken in. You've got the photosynthesis. You've got it all working together in this system that speaks of design and creation rather than natural selection. I'll give you another example. In you are lots of little bugs, we call them. Intestinal bacteria. Don't get grossed out. You've had them all your life. Bacteria are not part of the human body, but they do the things the body cannot do for itself, but which are necessary for its survival. They synthesize vitamins essential for nutrition, such as vitamin K, niacin, and B complex vitamins. So they put all that together from your food that you take in, or perhaps you take supplemental pills, vitamins to help make sure you're not depleted in these things. And they are the ones, these are the little things in you that synthesize that, put that all together. Now, you have in you friendly bacteria, it's often referred to as, and we will refer sometimes to probiotics and prebiotics. Probiotics are foods or supplements that contain these living microorganisms intended to maintain or improve the good bacteria in your body. And you get those from yogurt, sauerkraut, and so forth. Even just drinking water, it's going in. If you're taking good spring water, we kill a lot of that stuff with what we put in our water these days. And so there's not as much of that going in. But if you're just going out for a walk and you wanted to have a fresh drink of water from a waterfall, for example, and you just took that in, there'd be all kinds of little microorganisms going into your body. And your microflora is being built up by that. That's normal microflora. That's referred to as good bacteria. But you also have in you this unfriendly or harmful bacteria, pathogens, and so you've got probiotics that fight against, or you've got this friendly bacteria that fights against the harmful bacteria. And to feed the probiotics, you eat prebiotics. Prebiotics are certain high fiber foods that act as food for the microflora that's in you. So, for example, whole grains, bananas, greens, onions, garlic, soybeans, artichokes, these things are good for the microflora in you. I searched in vain to find potato chips and all of the things we really like Doritos and all. It's not there, not helpful to them. In fact, they tell us that it actually can be very harmful because of the high salt content, and it actually kills this friendly bacteria that we need to actually build up. And that's important. Sometimes perhaps you've been in a situation where you're given antibiotics. Antibiotics have their place in society, but we have way overdone it with antibiotics. Now doctors are giving them out so freely that it kills both kinds of bacteria in you. And so you're kind of starting all over again, but you're killing that which God put in you to help you. So it should be reserved for just necessary times. When I come out of surgery, they say ahead of time, we're going to be giving you antibiotics. I say, no, you're not. No, I don't want that in there unless there's a really good reason, because they're actually overdoing it these days. Bacteria synthesize niacin to make NAD, which is necessary for energy conversion in the cell's mitochondria. The human body itself cannot synthesize NAD, but it is essential to life. So this is an example of symbiosis. The nature is not in tooth and claw in every area. Here's an area where it's working together. This microbiotics in you working with your body for a common good. Here's another example. Termites and microscopic protozoa. Microscopic protozoa is like a parasite that breaks down the cellulose structure in the timber that the termite's eating, but it shares enough nutrients to keep the termite alive. Neither the termite nor the protozoa can live without the other. So we think it's, well, my house got eaten with termites. No, it's actually the protozoa doing it, but they're working together. Here's the acacia tree and the acacia ants. Much of the furniture for the tabernacle is made of acacia wood in the Old Testament days. Well, the ants live in a tree colony that may number 30,000. And the tree gives them food, and they give it protection from herbivores by attacking any other insects that try to feed on the tree. And so these trees cannot survive without their ants, according to one researcher named there. They work together. Here's another example of symbiosis. Fish and bacteria flashlights. The flashlight fish depends on colonies of luminescent bacteria to pack its light organs. The fish furnishes the bacteria with food in a stable environment, and the bacteria serve as the fish's light. The fish controls the light by means of an eyelid-like shutter. Then there's the shrimp and the goby fish. Now, we don't have this so much here in our part of the world, but the shrimp, the snapping shrimp and the goby fish have a symbiotic relationship. The shrimp has poor eyesight, and it's dependent on the goby for protection. The shrimp builds the system of tunnels that the two live in, and then when the shrimp goes outside, it keeps one antenna on the goby. And if the goby senses danger, it darts back into the tunnel. The shrimp is right behind it. Then there's pollination, another example how nature is not all tooth and claw. The pollination system is finely tuned as a symbiotic process, and it involves countless different types of flowers, insects, and birds, all perfectly integrated to maintain life. In flowers, the process usually involves transferring the pollen grains from the stamen to the stigma, and the result is the formation of a seed. Sometimes the transfer is done by air, but usually it is done by insects and birds. So you know how you take a little dandelion and it's turned gray and you blow it and the seeds go everywhere. That would be an example of it being done by air. And sometimes maybe a bird or something will drop it from the air and it will put weeds into your nice grass or whatever. Well, insects and birds are the more common way of pollinating. There are a bewildering number of different systems for pollination. Just among orchids alone, there are hundreds of different methods. Each one of these is amazingly complex, and the process is hardwired in the DNA of the plant and animal, except for minor variations. So, nectar. Many orchids produce sweet nectar to attract insects. The nectar itself is complex, being composed of sugar, amino acids, lipids, organic acids, minerals, vitamins, enzymes, antioxidants, ions, and metabolites. Then there's this matter of odor. Different orchids use different types of odors to attract pollinators. This is amazing. Some even use the odor of rotting meat to attract flies and carrion beetles, such as the Bulbophyllum beckeri, and it's said to smell like a herd of dead elephants. Now, not having smelled a herd of dead elephants, I can't really tell you what it's like, but if you want to know what it smells like, go find one of these Bulbophyllum beckeri. But it uses odor. It also uses color to attract pollinators. Those that are pollinated by hummingbirds and butterflies tend to have red, orange, and pink flowers, and they're not necessarily fragrant. They're just made for beauty. And then there's mimicry. The moth orchid, the Phalaenopsis, has blooms that look like moths. Can you see that? The wind makes it flutter a little bit, and it's like a moth. And it attracts real moths, who then pollinate it. Another example of mimicry is the Ophrys family of orchids. And they look like the female of the bee species that pollinates them. It really is astounding. It attracts then the males, and there's therefore a pollination going on. Some Ophrys look like flies. And then there are other ways that there's deception going on, sexual deception. Some orchids attract a specific type of male insect by producing a chemical odor that imitates the sex pheromones of the female. He's thus tricked into landing on the flower and picking up pollen to carry to another flower. There's sexual deception when the plant imitates the appearance of a female insect. The lip of the looking glass orchid is surrounded by a fringe of red hairs, just like those on the body of the female wasp. And there's a bluish mirror-like patch in the center of the lip, which looks like her shimmering wings. And so it's made so that the male wasp will come over and be very interested, and in the process is pollinating this little orchid. There's perfect timing involved in pollination. The looking glass orchid is visited only by male wasps of one particular species. The males emerge 1 month before the females, which is exactly when the looking glass orchid flowers. Isn't that another evidence that they are designed? There are traps. This is symbiosis. We have the bucket orchid that has a little bucket of nectar. Above it's a rounded pad that's saturated with a fragrant oil that male bees like to pack into the sacs on their back legs to use to court females. It happens to smell like the pheromones bees use to attract mates. Well, maybe it's not coincidence. Maybe God did this. Since the surface of the flower is slippery, a bee often slips into the bucket. The only way to escape drowning is through a narrow channel at the base of the lip, and as the bee squeezes out, 2 grains of sticky pollen are deposited on his back. There are also rods that some orchids have, and these phragmipediums, they produce long petals that trail to the ground so that an ant or some other crawling insect can just crawl right on up there, goes right to their pollen, they pick it up, carry it elsewhere. Shooting pollen. The catasetum orchid has a little hair trigger mechanism that, when touched, fires a sticky pollen at the insect. High-speed photography has found that the amazing trigger fires at 1.3 meters per second, and this is a plant. The trigger mechanism is tuned to be set off only when the right size bee lands on it. So wind or falling water or lighter insects don't affect it. Charles Darwin actually wrote a book entitled On the Various Contrivances by which British and Foreign Orchids are fertilized by insects, and his favorite was the Catasetum fimbriatum with this little trigger. And here's how it works. All right, I have to show that to you again. I hope you saw that. It's really quick. Yep. 1.3 meters a second. Darwin was so blind to think that all of this mind-boggling complexity and this beautiful symbiosis could have evolved naturally. Evolutionists now speak of what they call co-evolution. The concept was invented by Alfred Wallace, who published a report on evolution by natural selection before Darwin. He had this insight while practicing witchcraft in South America. In virtually all cases, the orchid and pollinator have evolved together, they suggest. Well, if it was done together, why couldn't we just say that they were made the same creation week by a wise creator? The buff-tailed sickle-billed hummingbird beside one of the flowers to which they're specialized, showing how the flower and recurved bill have co-evolved, says UC Berkeley News. When Darwin examined the Madagascar orchid with its 280 millimeter nectar tube, he predicted that a moth would be found with a 200 millimeter proboscis. Now, we're talking something that big. And it's going to have a proboscis, which is this little attachment that comes off the head, that's going to be that size to be able to get down there and get the nectar in this orchid. Sure enough, 21 years after his death, they discovered the Morgan's Sphinx moth. It was first filmed in its nocturnal routine in 2004 by Philip de Vries.
It's hovering in front of the orchid. There it is. Look at the tongue's coming out, man. Amazing. Look at that. There it goes. It's trying to find the opening. There it goes. It's in.
Evolutionists say, see, Darwin was right. It's coevolution. But such evolution would have had to have taken place literally the same week, which sounds more like creation. A vast amount of perfect genetic information and processes are involved in producing an orchid and a moth that operate in such perfect harmony. No Darwinian process accounts for such a thing. But the Bible does. And what they do is they use circular reasoning. They assume that evolution happened, so they conclude that these things must have co-evolved. But without the assumption, there's no evidence. Another example of symbiosis, consider the Earth's ecosystem. Modern science has disproven evolution by learning that we live in a fantastically complex, interrelated system. There's the oxygen cycle. Plants take in carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. You and I, as well as animals, take in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide, so we help each other out. That's symbiosis. The water cycle, you've got vaporization, buoyancy, condensation, precipitation, soil permeation, distribution. Goes up. In evaporation, we say, oh, it's a humid day. That's water rising. That becomes eventually clouds. It rains. It waters our fields so we can eat and drink and live. And it just goes back and forth in the water cycle. Plants and their ecosystem. The living, growing biosphere is a complex interwoven network of nutrients and animal and plant life. There's an interconnectedness between soil, microbes, plants, pests, and human health. Once you start to connect all the dots, you begin to understand the depth of nature's intelligence, which always strives to maintain balance. Well, I wouldn't say nature's intelligence, but maybe God's. Dr. Suzanne Simard had something to say about this. University of British Columbia.
But while evolutionary theory told a story about competition, the trees themselves were telling her a different story.
We think of them as these individuals that are just competing against each other. You know, I'm going to get this and I'm going to get it and you're not going to get it. And that's really led a lot of the thinking, and we've long ignored, a lot of the other interactions other than competition. But at the same time, there's a community effect that we haven't understood, and we're just starting to really look at this and understand that this is a system. It's not just a bunch of individuals competing against each other. They're working together to make this system work.
Not just a bunch of individuals competing against each other. It's a system helping each other out. Let me help us understand this. Plants communicate with other plants using chemical signals that are going through the air at all times. And underneath the ground, they have fungi that connect as well. Mycelial networks. Fungi below the ground have a symbiotic relationship with plants. They colonize the roots and act as root extensions. There's communication between the fungi and the plants. Fairy rings are evidence of a massive underground network of fungi. The mushrooms, which are fruiting bodies of the fungi, mark the outer periphery of the network. Then there's the mycorrhizae. Myco comes from fungus. Rhizae is the roots, and so that's the fungi root system. Over 90% of plants have a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizae. One thimbleful of healthy soil contains several kilometers of living fungal filaments. How many kilometers did we uproot yesterday out here in the gardens? The fungi get carbon from the plants. In turn, the fungi assist the plant in absorption of water and nutrients, increasing absorption by 100 to 1,000 times. They act as an immune system to protect plants from pathogens and herbivores and parasitic plants. They sound alarm against invaders. This fantastically complex system of dumb plant life communicates and works together. And just to wrap this all up, Darwin didn't know about all of this perfect design. He didn't know how perfectly interconnected everything is. And so his so-called science is based on ignorance. It's been shown that now that evolution is not science. So to summarize, we've made 4 points about natural selection. Number one, natural selection is the main mechanism of evolution proposed by Darwin, referring to survival of the fittest, which is supposed to result in change to creatures that leads to evolution, but it can only explain minor variations in creatures, like the different beak sizes of a finch. So, micro but not macro evolution. Natural selection cannot build because it cannot add new information to the DNA. That's a game changer when we grasp that concept. Natural selection would not preserve something that would not be helpful for the creature's immediate survival. And then natural selection requires struggle everywhere. But life shows interconnectivity. The fact that life is a giant system refutes natural selection. I close with some words from these scientists.
Suppose you do evolve it in 2 or 3 pieces, and they sit around for centuries. They don't confer any advantage on the organism, but they don't harm it either. So they're these strange accretions on which natural selection is neutral. It doesn't select for them, but it doesn't select against them. And then after eons and eons, we worry about the maths later, after eons and eons, the final piece drops into place and suddenly it functions. Plausible?
No, that's ridiculous. I mean, realistically, would you?
He's being very careful of Darwin, but he's swatting me aside.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, if you think, suppose you didn't have a mousetrap. So you say, well, what can I do? I'll just go into my garage and pick out a few pieces that would function as a mousetrap. And you say, well, I need a spring. Well, here's one in this grandfather clock I have. You wind up, I'll just use that. And I need a hammer to squash the mouse. I'll use this crowbar over here. But the pieces aren't adjusted to each other. You can't just take random pieces and put them together. And natural selection, which, as Darwin said, is constantly scrutinizing life, would not be expected to make things in the shape that they would need to be for some future use. They would they would hone them for what they were doing right now.
All right.
Can I weigh in on
Sure,
this?
of
Because
course.
there's a connection between what Mike's talking about and the mathematical problems that John was alluding to. And that is that in these actual systems, these nanomachines that Mike has made famous through his work, for example, the bacterial flagellar motor or the ATP synthase, one's a rotary.
This man has made the flagellar motor a rock star.
Well, he kind of has. He kind of has. But it's a 30-part rotary engine. The ATP synthase is a turbine with multiple parts. But the parts are made of proteins. And proteins are in essence, the toolbox of the cell. They perform specific functions in view of their three-dimensional shapes. So they make the parts of molecular machines. They function as enzymes to catalyze reactions at super fast rates. They help process information. But if you were to build a system like the flagellar motor, you need 30 proteins that fit together in an integrated fashion. But that requires genetic code. Each one of those proteins requires a long stretch of genetic information to build the protein. And so what you're talking about is not just, some bent hammer or something sitting around doing nothing. You're talking about a need for genetic information that is sufficient to overcome these long odds against building the protein in the first place. So it'd be like, to change the metaphor slightly, a gigantic haystack the size of the North American continent, and you're only allowed to search 1/1037th of the continent, maybe a tiny little square of Southern California. If that's the case, are you more likely or less likely to find the needle? To find the needle. And the answer is you're overwhelmingly more likely not to find the needle than to find it, which is to say the mutation selection mechanism lacks the creative power to generate new biological information.
Close to the creative.
Exactly, and that's for one protein.
That's one protein out of 13 proteins necessary to make the waving little tail, which is only one machine. All right.
Yeah. And that, in a sense, is before you said anything about the fact that the information required is linguistic. And linguistic language is not produced by random processes.
Right.
And this is a hugely important
You've got to explain
thing.
what you mean by that. It's
take
linguistic in the way the
take
DNA...
the human genome.
Code.
Exactly, yes.
Code.
The human genome is the longest word we've ever discovered. And we can call it a word because it's written in a chemical language of 4 letters. And all those letters, strung out like a computer program, have got to be in the right order, otherwise it breaks down. I mean, most programs, if you change a letter, that's the end of the program. So we're dealing with something absolutely gigantic in terms of probabilities before we even think of the extra complexity that arises through the folding of the proteins and all the epigenetic information that's been discovered in recent years. That's then
information beyond DNA that controls how the lower level information is used.
Bewildering in its complexity. And therefore it becomes a huge stress. And my own simplistic view is to say I prefer an explanation that makes sense to one that doesn't make sense.
If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So said Charles Darwin. And that's exactly what has been shown. With natural selection being so unscientific, how have evolutionists responded? Well, they suggest that new information comes from mutations. And Lord willing, next time we'll consider 5 reasons why that explanation is also unscientific. I prefer to take what John 1:3 says, all things were made by him, Christ, and without him, Christ, was not anything made that was made. And Heavenly Father, we do praise you that you are the maker of us and all that we see and hear and experience in this world. Help us, Lord, now as we seek to assimilate this into our thinking. In Jesus' name, amen.